All right.
So today, we're going to continue this ridiculously long PowerPoint. It is my goal to get through as much as soon as possible, so lots of me talking, decent amount of notes, but like I said the other day when I was out, you did have an opportunity to preview most of this. So hopefully your note taking is fairly minimal. But again, just kind of continue taking notes, ask questions if you have them. Just keep in mind I am going to be moving pretty darn quick. Other news and notes, just kind of reminders, that document analysis from Monday extended the due date. That was due last night. If for some reason you did not get it in, please do so as soon as possible. The SAQ we did last week, because I was sick and stuff, I'm behind on that. So I'm going to be grading those over the next several days. It's my goal over the weekend to get completely caught up on grades. At least as far as the SAQ and the documents are concerned, and any late work thus far. So that'll be up to date relatively soon. The only other thing of note is you do have a notebook check coming up tomorrow. The list of what you need is both on the board. It's also already in Canvas, so whenever you're ready, obviously after we're done with notes, but go ahead and submit that and get that out of the way. The only other announcement, and I think I kind of alluded to this, but at some point, either at the very end of next week or maybe the Monday of the following week, we are going to do an essay. It's been a while. It's not going to be a DBQ. It's going to be a regular long essay, which that's really been a while since we did. At least somewhat connected to all of this, the Industrial Revolution. Now, the PowerPoint's going to be done this week, but we're still going to be doing some stuff, kind of connected to it next week as well. At the end of next week, we'll go over how to do the essay again. Again, we'll go through the rubrics. We'll look through some examples. You're going to be good to go. But that is going to be our first test grade of the 6 weeks. So again, all the specific notes, all the vocab, all the good stuff you can accumulate, it is going to help you out later because remember, in our writings, you do need to be specific. That's coming, like I said, at earliest, maybe next Friday, but I'm actually thinking probably the following Friday. We'll probably be talking about exactly how to do it next Friday. But today, like I said, kick back, pay attention, stay awake. I know sometimes my voice can kind of put you asleep, but don't let it. Take some good notes and just try to kind of appreciate how impactful all this was. But before we get into the PowerPoint, we do have our Holocaust moment of the day. This is our third little mini lesson over the Holocaust. Again, this is Holocaust Remembrance Week. This one is titled, How Will You Be Known? Read along with me. Yesterday, we talked about being an upstander and what that means. During the Holocaust, there were many brave upstanders. In fact, several of them lived in North Texas. One of those upstanders was Irina Sendler. Irina was a social worker who lived in Poland during the Holocaust. She smuggled many children out of one of the areas that the prisoners were forced to live in. Irina's extreme bravery saved many children from certain death. Many people worldwide chose to be an upstander. One was named Oskar Schindler. Oskar owned factories in Poland. He employed some of the people that were considered not good enough by the government in his factories and told authorities they could not be killed because they were being used to make the supplies that the Nazi army needed. By taking this stand, Oskar Schindler saved over 1,200 people from certain death. You may never be in a history book because of your bravery or kindness, but that does not mean you shouldn't choose upstanding when given a chance. Even if you only make the difference in one person's life, you still made a difference. That person will be changed and impacted because of you and your actions. Again, choose to be an upstander. So where we left off yesterday, let's go ahead and get this started. Yep, that's working. We talked about movement, mass migration, people from all over the world, using these new steamships and trains and just, easier, cheaper forms of transportation to move to cities by and large, okay, to these industrialized areas, to these industrialized countries in the pursuit of jobs and just hopefully a better way of life. Some people found that. Others came to these cities and found that, man, cities, in the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, man, they were rough places. A lot of people showed up. Urbanization was massive. You had overcrowding. You had a rise in crime. You had pollution, obviously. Weren't always enough jobs for people. You did have extreme poverty. You did have disease. One of the things that we talked about were tenements. Guys, tenements were about the worst sort of place you could live in a city. They were in the most rundown areas. And they were run by slumlords that were really just out to make a buck. They didn't care about the comfort or the safety of the people that lived there. They tried to pack as many people into these I say apartments, but really tiny little rooms as possible because they were making money. And frankly, that's all a lot of people could afford. Now, some people that started to do better for themselves later on, they moved to the outskirts of the cities, and you start to see suburban areas form. But a lot of those individuals were not that lucky. We also talked about the idea of the ethnic enclave, that immigrants from foreign lands oftentimes move to communities with other immigrants from the same place. Chinatown, Little Italy, places like that, great examples of ethnic enclaves. That's some good vocab to know because that's a phenomenon you're going to see throughout world history, especially during this time period. Life in the tenement is pretty awful. I mean, these buildings were thrown up as quickly as possible with the cheapest materials possible. A lot of the rooms didn't have windows. They didn't have running water. They may or may not have had some sort of communal area where you could use the bathroom, but this was the bare minimum. I mean, just imagine, living in a place with your family that maybe is no bigger from my desk to, I don't know, maybe that bookshelf over there. And maybe as narrow as, I don't know, this wall all the way to this second row of seats. And that's the sort of size that we're looking at. 10, 12, 15 people stacked in there because that's all they could afford. Again, a lot of people came to the cities looking for work because, like I said, farming was less of an option, as history progressed. But what they found is most of the jobs were, requiring unskilled labor. They didn't pay a whole lot. It was a real struggle for many to survive. Really sad time to be alive. Life in cities early on, not so great. You go into the early, days of urbanizations, the late 1700s, all the way up until the mid to late 1800s. Most cities didn't have running water. You were still having to go to a well. You were having to go to some sort of area where you could get that and then walk it back home. I mean, that's pretty insane. A lot of cities did not have functioning sewers until the late 1800s. So just imagine this. It's the middle of the night. You're in the tenement. You're living in this squalor. You get up. You go probably do your business. Use the bathroom in some sort of bucket. All right? You got to carry this thing outside because you don't have a window. There's no sewer. What do you do with it? Think about it. You just dump it out. You dump it on the streets. That's disgusting. What if 10,000 people are also doing that? Even more. You can kind of see how gross a lot of these cities were. Again, they grew so fast that, local governments, they had to play catch up. They had to figure out how to fix some of these problems. Getting rid of your waste in an effective manner, it's one of the chief things all cities need to be able to do, because if you've got waste just piling up, and I'm talking human waste and others, you're going to get disease. You're going to have really gross conditions. Give you another example. We said that automobiles, really the first automobile I think shows up in 1885. The founder of Mercedes-Benz was kind of the founder or the inventor of the first automobile. But we said that they weren't really popularized because they were so expensive up until, man, the early 1900s. So people coming around the city, traveling throughout the city, they were either going by foot or they were using like horse-drawn carriages. I mean, they were still doing that into the late 1800s. Horses poop a lot, meaning there was a lot of horse poop on the streets as well. I know I've said poop too many times already, but I'm just trying to illustrate a point. You've got human waste on the streets because of the lack of effective sewer systems. You've got a lot of animal waste on the streets. Guys, that is a breeding ground for disease. That is a very tough situation to be in. And unfortunately, that was a reality of a lot of cities, during this time period, up through and into the early 20th century. You didn't always have garbage men. That's something people had to figure out as well. So in a lot of areas, people just kind of threw their trash into the street. Again, I'm trying to paint a picture of how disgusting things were. There's smoke everywhere, this thick black smog. They didn't have the Environmental Protection Agency yet. They didn't have a lot of the standards that businesses have to follow. And when you've got these factories, burning fossil fuels, primarily coal in the early days, I mean, that stuff's everywhere. And just breathing that stuff in will make you sick. In London, and we might watch a video over this, but London, very early industrialized area, you see old movies and it's always like kind of foggy. It ain't always fog. A lot of that's just pollution, Again, they called some of that smog the London fog. But again, it wasn't always naturally occurring. Again, disease runs rampant. We will talk about a certain disease, cholera, which was, one of the big pandemics of the time. A lot of it had to do with unsanitary conditions in cities. Essentially, things are crowded, they were unsafe. Now, as time progressed, city governments reacted. Local governments, put certain things in place. You start to see more effective sewer systems. That's one of the big things. You do, by the very late 1800s, start to see running water and flush toilets. You start to see more public sewers. You start to see more of a shift to paved roads. Just imagine how gross the dirt roads were beforehand with all that stuff floating around. Electrification, street lights, a greater presence of police, to kind of enforce the law, refrigeration. But that was all a process. And the moral of the story is, these cities grew so big so fast because of industrialization that everything had to be established. Like I said, all these things we take for granted today, it took years and years of these problems developing to really kind of create those safety nets, if you will. Another example, this applies directly to you guys, public education. For most of human history, in all these civilizations we've talked about, public education was not completely non-existent, but it was rare. Education was seen as a privilege. The upper classes, the nobility, the aristocrats, whatever you want to call them, the people that could afford to hire people to educate their young, the rich folks, they got an education. But as far as your standard everyday person, you kind of learn from your family, you learn lessons from life and from your community. Actual public education as you know it today, where you're required to be here, you start in kindergarten or first grade and go all the way to 12th grade, that comes from this time period as well. Now, some of this goes back to the ideas of the Enlightenment, having more equity, having more free access to information. And those are some basic Enlightenment ideals. But really, you see public education born out of a few different things. First, people started to catch on that putting little kids to work in factories and mines is not cool. I mean, when little Tommy comes home and his arm got ripped off, and essentially all that happened was, well, now little Tommy doesn't have a job. Good luck, The outcry got so loud where governments had to step in. But the parents are going to work all day. You've got to have somewhere for the kids to go. So that was an issue. But you also had the fact that as time progressed and, the nature of work became a little bit more complicated, You needed people with a higher skill level, a higher level of knowledge, some education for management, for different sort of white collar jobs that we're developing. Again, we start with the factories, but everything starts to spawn around that. All sorts of goods and service industries develop. So even the industrialists were like, hey, we got to have some sort of system to educate our young. So what happens? You need people that can read, that can write, people with some more advanced skills. Well, by the time you get to the very late 1800s, 1870s, most governments in Europe passed laws requiring education for all male children and girls a little bit later on, which again goes to show you the patriarchal nature of things. The effect, okay? You get public education based around the factory system. Just bear with me. So a couple little details. Lower class children, they didn't go as long, mainly only the early years. Upper class children typically went longer into your upper grades, to high school, to college, hopefully. Out of this education, you do have new job opportunities. And because more people learn to read and write, newspapers, and especially like political cartoons, they become much more prominent. Guys, public education, though, is based on the factory system. Okay, it is a reflection of the factory system. So just think about it. You're in the factory. The day starts. You hear a bell or a whistle, and that means get your butt to work. And you go over to your machine, or you go over to the assembly line, or you go over to whatever you do, and you work for X amount of time. And then another whistle blows, and hey, now it's time to take your little break. Then another whistle blows, and maybe that's a time to, hey, everybody stop work. Let's check the machines. Let's make sure, somebody didn't get their finger chopped off. And then another whistle blows, and you get back to work. Think about school. You come here in the morning. You're talking to your friends. This weird bell rings, and that's your signal to go to first period. And you come, hey, it's first period, you come to me, and you learn a little bit about history, hopefully. And then your next period, the signal is the bell rings, and then you go to English class, and then another bell rings, and you go to science, then another bell rings, and you go to lunch, and then another bell rings, and another bell rings, and another bell rings, and the day is done. And you start the whole process tomorrow. I couldn't teach you science. I really couldn't teach you much of anything but history. That's my thing. Maybe your English teacher, maybe that's kind of their thing. All right. Rather than have all of us try to teach you, like you guys in here all day, me teach you every subject like you had kind of to some extent in elementary school, we divide up that labor. So think of it like this. You are a product. I know this is dehumanizing, but it's the model. You're a product. I do my bit. English teacher does his bit. Science teacher does their bit. Okay. And at the end of the day, you're more of a finished product. But really, this assembly line you're on is going to take like 12 years. And theoretically, by the time you emerge from high school at this point, you are a finished product. You do have at least a semi-decent foundation of knowledge to kind of build off of. Guys, this whole system, it came out of the factory system. They looked to the factory system to kind of model it off of. Now, obviously, it's more complicated than that. But I'm telling you, things look like they do for a reason. Public education comes out of needs of the Industrial Revolution, which, maybe isn't always perfect, but it's better than going and working in the coal mines, I think. I mean, look at this kid. He's got what is he, 4? And he's got a pipe in his mouth, and he's got his canteen, and I'm assuming that's like a pickaxe. He's ready to go to the coal mine. That's demented. Okay, this kid needs to be in school, and luckily, today, theoretically, you would be. Again, it evolves over time, obviously, but public education comes in large part because of all this. The nature of family life, and I kind of said this earlier, changes forever. Prior to industrialization, most people live on farms. They live out in the country. Family members are together, all day, every day, working on the farm. Or maybe they're craftsmen, maybe they're blacksmiths, maybe they have their own little cottage industries, but still the families are together almost all the time. Once you start to see a shift more towards an industrial labor force, families go their separate ways every day. And this is back before you had kind of your standard 8-hour days, your 40 hours a week. Maybe you only work 5 days. I mean, not everybody has that schedule, but that is something that a lot of people get to enjoy now. Back then, on average, a lot of factory workers were working 14, 15, 16-hour days. They were working 6 days a week. Guys, working that much makes you tired. And when you're tired, especially if you're working in a dangerous occupation like mining or working with machinery, well, that's how these little kids end up looking like they do. Exhaustion regularly led to accidents, resulting in injury and death. And again, this stuff's going on for years. So you're going to see changes come. You're going to see people start to speak out. Especially as newspapers get more popular, it's easier to spread the word. It's easier for people to really demand government change, to demand government reform, because in the early days of industrialization, there were almost no rules. It was dog eat dog, every man for himself. Well, after years of that happening, governments decide, hey, we got to regulate at least somewhat, and that does evolve over time as well, but it isn't right away. Family life changes forever, so do social classes. You look at most of history and you look in most civilizations, you have a pretty rigid social hierarchy. I mean, it's different, from place to place, but for most of history, at the bottom of society, you have some form of forced or coerced labor. We see slavery and things of that sort throughout history, and it's terrible and it's evil, but that is something that is a continuity. Next, you have your common folk, your everyday, workers that, they have some freedom, but they don't have many opportunities. There's some things they can't do. And then you have kind of your upper crust of society. You have your nobility. You have, your wealthy landowners. And at the top, you have whoever runs the country. I'm simplifying it. But you have your royal family, your king, your queen, whoever it is. That all starts to more or less fade away during this time period. Especially as more and more governments shift from being absolute monarchies to constitutional monarchies and then somewhat democratic, you start to see that really formal class system evaporate and something a little bit more akin to what we have today kind of become established. We still have social classes, but they're a lot harder to define, and there's social mobility, and a lot of it's just based on income. Well, this is the time period where that shift starts to take over. And in a lot of these areas, as industrialization and capitalism start to spread, which we're going to get into capitalism either later today or that'll be the big thing that we talk about tomorrow, you start to see new classes in society appear. At the bottom, I guess you could say, you've got your industrial working class. These are your workers. These are the people that go and they labor largely in the factories, in the mines. They're getting by. They're the ones living in the tenements, and they don't have many skills, and they don't have many opportunities for higher wages. And because their skill level is low, they're easily replaced. So they just got to kind of deal with it. But over time, especially as education becomes more important, you do see the emergence of kind of the somewhat modern middle class. You start to see these other sort of jobs develop, of shop owners, and the need for craftsmen is still around at some point, and managerial positions and office workers and accountants, and the list goes on and on. So the middle class starts to develop where people are making a little bit more money, they're having a little bit more opportunity, they're doing okay for themselves. At the top of society, though, no longer are we really looking at like royalty. We're looking at the wealthy industrialists. We're looking at these business owners, the people that own the factories, the people that really take advantage of the system. Now, some people call them captains of industry. That's a good term to know because they're the ones that kind of build up the societies that they live in. Next year, when you get to U.S. history, I can almost guarantee whatever teacher you have, you're going to watch a show called The Men Who Built America. And you're going to talk about like John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, very, very wealthy man, one of the wealthiest that ever lived. Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel, J.P. Morgan. The list goes on. You're going to hear about these guys who were super wealthy here in the United States. They were these captains of industry. And because they had so much wealth, they helped build up our country. They funded a lot of building projects, a lot of the building of our infrastructure, maybe for their own needs, maybe not. Some of them did donate a lot to charity. Okay, that's how some could view these. Others, though, called them robber barons. They started to see that, hey, most of us are just getting by, but you guys here at the top, you're getting filthy rich. Not that different from what we see today. You've got that 1% of the population that controls something like 90% of the nation or the world's wealth. That's pretty astonishing, but it's true. Well, that trend starts back then as well. Another really bad trend, though, and this is something we're still dealing with, and we just make worse and worse every day, and pollution. Burning coal and petroleum and natural gas, it has consequences. This is the time period that we really start seriously damaging our natural environment. Burning fossil fuels, creates pollution. These factories, have industrial waste. It sometimes seeps into the land, sometimes seeps into the water. The air becomes polluted by, the emissions, the carbon emissions, coming from the factories. And that's just something that continues to this day. On one hand, we have used the energy sources that come from our Earth to greatly benefit us and allow us to propel ourselves forward technologically and economically. But there is a cost there. And you look at the world today and, people are talking about climate change and all the things that we should be doing to, not be as damaging to our environment. And you got to understand, for most of human history, that wasn't as much of an issue. I mean, we always mess stuff up because we're people, and we would go in and cut down trees and do some stuff to mess up the environment, but nothing on this scale. You look at the real serious pollution, it starts with the Industrial Revolution. And it hadn't stopped yet. If anything, it's just grown and gotten worse. Now we're going to look at some economic and, just mainly economics, developments, innovations, types of business organizations, and responses to them. New ways of organizing businesses arose during the Industrial Revolution. Some manufacturers formed giant corporations in order to minimize their risk. For example, limited liability corporations are businesses chartered by a government as a legal entity owned by stockholders. Stockholders might receive sums of money known as dividends from a corporation when it makes profit. You look at the rise of corporations, which they incorporate themselves. That way they can't be sued, as individuals. They're held accountable as an entity. So they can only lose so much. It's part of the way that businesses sometimes protect themselves. But you look at the idea of the corporation, of the stock market, that all is a reflection of this time period as well. I mean, stock markets to some extent, joint stock companies that existed before, but never quite to this degree. Today, that's the model. You look at your big businesses. You look at companies like Amazon and Walmart, just, off the top of my head, McDonald's, These are these huge transnational businesses that in some cases have more wealth, more power, more influence than our world governments. That's a trend that starts back then as well. And if I move too fast, remember this is on Canvas, so if you need to go back and look over some stuff, you're good. If a corporation experiences a loss or goes bankrupt, the stockholders are not liable for their losses. The most they can lose is what they paid for the stock. Some corporations became so powerful that they could form a monopoly, meaning that they controlled all aspects of a specific business and eliminated all competition. Good example, John D. Rockefeller, we mentioned him earlier. He owned Standard Oil, but it got to the point that he not only owned, the different businesses that extracted oil, he also owned a lot of the businesses that refined the petroleum, that also transferred or transported the petroleum from here and there. And it got to the point that he controlled so much of the oil business in our country that, the government had to step in. Again, monopolies are bad because when you have no competition in business, if there's only one person to get your gas from or to get your Cheetos from or whatever, they can set the prices however they want, right? In the early days, businesses could kind of do what they wanted. And it took a while, and we'll get to this, but under the idea of capitalism, remember, governments kind of stay out of it. Well, in the early days, they more or less did, but some of these businesses, they kind of ran wild. And you do start to see, especially getting into the early 20th century, countries like ours and others have to step in and at least regulate to some extent. And that's kind of the constant battle to this day. How much government regulation should there be over the business world? Because under capitalism, we've got that philosophy of laissez-faire. The government should let the economy be. The problem is laissez-faire, sometimes some would say, is not always fair. This is a good word to know, transnational. In the early days, you had these companies that were based in England or the United States or France, Germany, or wherever. And their power and influence was pretty much just regional. But with advancements in technology and transportation, you start to see some of these corporations, some of these companies really reach across national boundaries to where they have business interests, they have factories, they have, trading partners all over the world. Okay, we refer to those as multinational or transnational businesses. A lot of those companies I named earlier, like Amazon, they're transnational businesses, meaning they got their finger in the pie just about everywhere. I'm giving you some examples of some of the first businesses like this, and I put them in red for a reason. These are mentioned specifically in our curriculum guide. So if you see these, you need to know these are some of the first companies that, man, they crossed those national boundaries and really gained a lot of power and influence as a result. You've got the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, the HSBC, which is still around. This was a London-based bank that expanded their operations into Hong Kong and Shanghai and a bunch of other places. Hong Kong at a certain point becomes a colony of Great Britain. We're going to get into that soon, but they become one of the largest banking outfits in the world. You had the Unilever Corporation, which I don't believe is around anymore, but they were like in household goods, mainly like the soap business. They had factories all over. Again, I believe they were a British company originally. I think they were British and Dutch. I think it was a partnership. But they had factories, as far away as Australia. Okay. Again, transnational. De Beers Mining Company, founded by a guy named Cecil Rhodes. They had a monopoly on the diamond industry for years and years. If you've ever heard the term like a Rhodes Scholar, that's him. That's Cecil Rhodes. Not a good guy, though. One of the chief advocates for the takeover of Africa in the 1800s, which does happen. But he had businesses, obviously back in Great Britain. He had them all throughout Africa, had them in a bunch of other locations as well. Again, this is the model now. This is what you see a lot of businesses really strive to do, to truly have this sort of global power and influence. And I think you could argue, a lot of people do, that some of these huge multinational corporations, guys, they're richer and more powerful than most governments. And that kind of a scary thing. Now, even though only a certain number of places were actually industrialized, that doesn't mean other people weren't involved. I mean, these industrialized nations like the United States, like the British, they had to have access to raw materials, to natural resources from all around the globe to be able to take back to their countries and turn into finished products. So a lot of these unindustrialized, unmodernized places, they're hooked in, but mainly as providing those resources and essentially becoming what we refer to as export economies. That is something worth knowing. The need for raw materials for factories and increased food supplies for growing urban populations led to the development of export economies around the world. These places specialized in the commercial extraction of natural resources and food production. The profits gained were used to purchase finished products from industrialized powers. So you've got these non-modernized countries that don't have factories, that are not on the same level as our industrial powers. They make money by exporting, whatever resources they have, and then a lot of that money is then used to purchase the finished products from the industrialized power. Again, it's definitely it's a money-making scheme, similar to triangular trade. Now, just to kind of show you some examples, you don't necessarily got to write these down, but I got a couple charts just showing you, different producers, different products made. Things like wheat and rubber and palm oil, which originally, was used in soap, but it was also used as a lubricant for machinery. You've got sugar. You've also got, food, because, food in these urban areas, you've got to have a large amount. Cotton, some of these things are coming from, modernized areas. Some of them are not, but they're all going to your industrial powers and getting turned into finished products. Yeah, rubber originally was natural. You may not know this, because the rubber that we use today is all synthetic. It's man-made. It's derived from petrochemicals from oil. But originally, rubber, like, your tires and other things made of rubber, they come from rubber trees, which is it's almost like a sap. It's like gum that comes out of some trees. And this was a very, very valuable resource. Found it a lot in the Brazilian Amazon. We found it in certain places in Africa, like the Belgian Congo, or the Congo originally, before Belgium took it over. You also have a need for minerals, copper and gold and diamonds and guano, which is bat poop, but it's a good fertilizer. Again, the story is, even the places that didn't have factories, because you're seeing the world get close together and you see globalized trade, they play a part in this as well. They're hooked in, usually through being export economies. The problem is, eventually these industrial powers, started to look at this situation saying, you know what? We would make a whole lot more money if we just controlled those areas that have the raw materials. And what you start to see, those countries that we had talked about before, and a few others, mainly European countries, but not all. The United States was kind of involved in this as well. They start a new wave of empire building, very similar to what we saw, during and after the Age of Exploration, where they started colonizing new lands. In the mid to late 1800s, Europeans, by and large, take over almost every part of Africa and will rule over most of it until after the World Wars. You start to see some areas that hadn't been formally colonized become fully colonized. This is when the British, for example, formed the largest empire in history. You start to see other areas, informally taken over. Bunch of different groups going to China, because China had kind of isolated themselves to some degree. They had fallen behind technologically, yet they still had a lot of people that could buy stuff. You saw, different powers go in there and kind of carve up China into spheres of influence. Latin America, because it was kind of on our side, well, that kind of becomes our sphere of influence, where we don't outright colonize any parts of Latin America. Although Puerto Rico, there's some stuff we definitely do take over, but most of it we just kind of, informally take over. This is a time period that we get places like Hawaii and Guam and, Alaska, and, all that stuff. Guys, you see a new wave of empire building that is directly tied to all this industrialization. As there's more products developed, and as some people get better jobs, and maybe jobs that they have a little bit more time on their hands and more money to spend, that's when you really kind of see this trend towards consumerism, just buying stuff, getting all this stuff that we don't necessarily absolutely need. You also see, as those middle and upper classes start to evolve, some of the more modern entertainment options that we see to this day. More of your organized spectator sports, rugby, soccer, football, baseball. You start to see leisure activities like bicycling, and as wealthy individuals can donate, you see more libraries and museums and public parks and music, concert halls. Carnegie Hall, that's named after Andrew Carnegie, the steel tycoon here in America. Again, the modern world is starting to take shape. But things ain't good for everyone. We're going to do one more slide. And a lot of it has to do with, the fact that things aren't always fair. There's still a lot of issues to contend with: the pollution, the unfair treatment of workers, the safety of children that's sometimes being ignored. So you start to see the growth of labor unions and a lot of social reform movements. Different groups of people really stepping up and saying, hey, things need to change. The harsh conditions of urban industrial life provoked resistance. Some workers formed labor unions to advocate for higher pay and safer conditions. The whole idea, if you can get workers unionized, get them on the same page, well, then they can make demands. If one worker says, hey, I need more pay, I need safer conditions, they can just fire that guy. But if everybody's unified and has a sense of solidarity, well, it's a lot harder for business owners to ignore that. It's through the work of labor unions that you see some basic things that we have today. Minimum wage laws in most countries, limits on hours worked, overtime pay. Hey, I've worked so many hours this week. This is excessive. I deserve more. Kind of the standard of the 5-day work week, which isn't for everything, but that ideal starts during this time period. Even expanded voting rights, more people of lower classes, eventually, women, the women's suffrage movement. A lot of this is kind of a result of these various social reform movements. Social reformers campaigned for more humane living conditions in cities and working conditions in factories. This is when you see a lot of the child labor laws fully go into effect. This is when we say, we already talked about compulsory or mandatory public education. This is when you start to see for the first time, hey, I got hurt at work. I should be compensated for that. I shouldn't just lose my job because I can't work anymore. This is the first time you start to see governments actually provide things like unemployment insurance. People actually, for the first time, certain companies forming pension plans, retirement plans for their employees. Again, a lot of changes come because of the problems that were created by the Industrial Revolution that people didn't necessarily foresee. But some activists, they said this wasn't enough. They rejected a lot of the norms of society. They said, the way that things are going, which industrialization kind of goes hand in hand with capitalism. Something we're going to get into more tomorrow, but we've talked about before. Some people say this whole social order, it is not fair. It's inherently unjust. The rich are always going to get richer by exploiting the masses, and the poor, man, they're going to struggle because of it. That's when you start to see alternate ideologies form against kind of the natural occurrence at this point of free enterprise, of capitalism, where the government kind of stays out of it. This is when you start to see socialism, which is something we still talk about quite a bit, and a more radical form of socialism, communism, develop. And those two things are going to be big movements in world history moving forward, and we're going to talk about them a lot. So tomorrow our goal, and this is kind of the last big thing we need to talk about, we're going to compare capitalism, socialism, and communism. It's going to be a real quick basic crash course in some basic economic philosophy. We've got a couple videos that we're going to watch. They're 2 or 3, but they're all really short. And then we'll have just a little bit more to do. The last part of this PowerPoint, it's a bunch of slides, but I'm just really quickly going to flip through some of the key figures, some of the key inventions, some of the key developments. It's not much as far as notes go. I'll ask you to maybe write down a couple examples. That's it. And then at the very end, I've got a chart that kind of summarizes a lot of the stuff that we've talked about this morning. So yeah, I don't see any reason we would not finish tomorrow. If anything, maybe on Monday there may be like a slide, but I'm hopeful that won't even be the case. Just a couple reminders. Tomorrow you do have your notebook check. The document analysis from earlier in the week is past due, so please get that in. Plus, all these notes, all this stuff. I mean, all these really specific things, they're going to be helpful later on because at some point in the near future, we are going to have an essay connected to this. So take some good notes, pay attention, and you should be in pretty good shape. Other than that, we're calling it a day.